All right, there we go. How we doing, everybody? Fantastic. Well, I want to welcome all of you. First, I'd like to thank the Westchester PD, the Oakland Cemetery, and the Westchester County Marine Corps League. Alrighty. The lungs on that guy, right? All right, so like I said before, I want to thank the Westchester PD, the Oakland Cemetery, Chester County Marine Corps League. Let's talk about why we're here. We're here on the 19th anniversary today of Boots on the Ground in Afghanistan, America's longest wars. Honor General Smedley Butler, right? And we're going to talk about him, but also the service members that never returned home. This is a multi-generational war, and it's nearing its second decade. In fact, there's people here in this audience who have no working memory of 9/11. That's pretty disconcerting, especially when you think that this is a war without any sort of congressional authorization, right? It's a war that has cost trillions of dollars, and more importantly, thousands of American lives and innocent lives overseas. Before I introduce the people here, There's a comedian. He goes by the name of Dave Smith. You would have never thought. But he has this really good quote. And he says, "What republic turns into an empire, exhausts itself way too thin militarily and financially, whose society starts to decay, and then everything turns out all right?" So I just want to part you with that. But I do want to talk about the people here. Mr. Dan McKnight. He's the founder of Bring Our Troops Home. He's here. I can't wait to hear him talk. Then we have retired Major Danny Sjursen. He's an Army officer. He was a history professor at West Point. He's the author of Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, and Patriotic Descent, America in the Age of Endless Wars. Then we have the great Scott Horton, who I feel like we should all have to climb a mountain just to get 5 minutes with, but he's lucky enough to grace us with his presence. He's the editorial director of Antiwar. He's a director of the Libertarian Institute. He's the author of Fool's Errand, Time to End the War of Afghanistan, and the host of the Scott Horton Show, where he's conducted over 5,000 interviews on foreign policy. I also want to introduce here John Emmons, GOP candidate for PA 6. He was the first one to sign the War Powers Pledge. So, given all that, I would like to lead into the color guard. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with... Thank you. So let's bring up Danny Sjursen.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm glad to see that we have people from a few different states that I've talked to about this issue, because I think despite the fact that this is one of the more grotesque aspects of American foreign policy in its history, it is a rare thing indeed to get a politician or a mainstream media outlet to talk about it. I was extraordinarily be asked to come here by Dan. it really is an honor on a number of levels to be part of this. First of all, in this group, if anything, I'm probably the vaguely left-leaning person to the extent that I even have an affiliation. But that's proof some that are stronger than Democrat, Republican, red team, blue team. And that's a veteran tribe who's been there, who's done that. It's about the nation. It's not about party. And here to see Smedley Butler's graveside, to speak here on this day, is a particular honor for me because I'm a geek, okay? I'm a history guy. I've written about Smedley Butler. I used to teach about Smedley Butler and have my cadets at West Point read about him. That's kind of a non sequitur. You wouldn't expect that. I don't know if I was the first history instructor to talk about Smedley Butler, but wasn't in the syllabus, okay? Just to be here, I think there's no better spokesperson for this moment, as awful as that can be, Smedley Butler, because as I'll talk about, he predicted a lot of this 70, 80, 90 years ago. In a sense, because I've been following Smedley Butler's career for so long, I feel like I'm on a bit of a pilgrimage. And if you'll forgive the cliche and perhaps romantic coincidence that I found, Smedley Butler was in the Marine Corps for, about 33 years, which is precisely the length of, Jesus Christ's life, if you, sort of follow the general scholarly literature on it. But in other ways, he's kind of more like St. Paul in that he really did have a road to Damascus moment. And then he went on his apostolic journey, preaching peace or preaching war only when it's in national defense for the following 9 years, coast to coast, until he worked himself to death, losing 30 pounds. And as I'll tell you, he didn't have a lot of pounds to lose to begin with. And really tiring himself out and getting ill and just working himself into the grave. But it's funny, all the things he did that I'll talk about, that was probably the greatest period of service of all that he gave to his country. On one sense, I feel kind of utterly inadequate at this grave, thinking about my own military descent at the end of my career, how long it took, the work I've done since then. How could it ever measure up to the Smedley Butler level of influence and critique? But then at the same time, I think, who could measure up to this man who is largely forgotten today, but in his own time was this towering figure? A few things struck me this week that I think are worth considering about Smedley Butler and his connection to the forever wars, his connection to the war in Afghanistan, and the military-industrial complex. First of all, why is it that Smedley Darlington Butler, two-time Medal of Honor winner, is all but lost to history today? I mean, he was once so popular. He was one of the most popular speakers in a time where people cared about public speakers of his age, coast to coast, filling all kinds of different organizations, left, right, somewhere in the middle. But he's lost to us. I think part of it is because World War II breaks out at the very end of his life, and then the United States involved about a year after he dies. And so his critique of war looks, he was kind of wrong about it or something because we had to fight the Nazis. Well, that's a misunderstanding, I think, of some of what Smedley Butler wrote, because he always felt that in times of crisis, if there was a need to defend the nation, then that was an acceptable use of force. But he's kind of the Smedley Butler critique, the baby's thrown out with the bathwater, along with this idea of isolationism. But I think that the main reason that he's forgotten is because he challenged bipartisan power. He made people feel uncomfortable. He makes us feel uncomfortable today when we read his critiques. And you know what? We need a little discomfort. And it's folks like that who challenge us intellectually that we most need, but sometimes they're kind of suppressed. Dan's going to talk a lot about this. Scott's going to talk a lot about the present day. But there was a Stars and Stripes headline about a week and a half ago, and it read, "Years after they fought in Afghanistan, troops watch children deploy to the same war." That was the headline. a military independent newspaper in the United States of America. I mean, is that obscene? Is that grotesque? Of course it is. There's no precedent for it in American history. Why is that not a national scandal? Why is every polite establishment newspaper not reporting it every single day until the war ends? And I think that's the rub. To a large extent, the American people have become a bit numb to war that continues forever. They're immune, distracted. The media is misleading in many cases or misdirects them to other issues. Let's follow the latest tweet by our favorite politician or our least favorite politician and sort of forget that we've been at war as long as we have. Get ready for it. If we don't end the war in Afghanistan soon, if we don't support whomever wants to end it, then we need to prepare ourselves for a soldier who is born after 9/11 dying in Afghanistan or some other war. That could be, I think, a point of no return for what's left of sort of a republic and its aspirations. More obscene still, I think you've seen a bipartisan enterprise of erasure of this war. And it's, certain Republicans, it's a lot of the Democrats, which some people might not assume. And even many of the veterans who go to Congress, they really haven't followed through once they have to raise all that money. And we see the absurd situation where all of the Democrats and many of the Republicans are cutting off the funds to end a war. They've never cut off funds. They're cutting off funds that would be necessary to end a war because they don't like the person ending it. And it really doesn't matter what you think about the individual person. That seems pretty obscene. But I can't help thinking through all the things I'm describing, WWSD, what would Smedley do? And I'll tell you this, he'd call bull. And he'd yell to the high heavens. He'd mix his clear intellect with the earthy, coarse barracks language of an officer, no matter how high he rose, who never lost the pulse of the soldiers. And he still talked like them. And if you read War is a Racket, if you read a lot of his essays and speeches, it's earthy and it's grounded, and in some ways it's barracks talk mixed with intellect, and it's a beautiful thing. I think that's the other reason that Smedley is ever relevant, especially today. He's unifying, he's country first, and here's the other thing, he's hardly a dove. This isn't some peacenik hippie who can't stand his country and wants to tear it down. I mean, a lot of people know the broad strokes of Smedley Butler, but he's a peculiar man. Smedley, Darlington, Butler. Symbolic in a way of the inherent duality of man, a walking contradiction, but in all the most beautiful ways. He's from a Quaker family and education, but he fights in 10 combat deployments, maybe more depending how you count. He's a diminutive guy. He's about 5'7" and 135, 40 pounds, sopping wet. But he wins 2 Congressional Medal of Honors. What would have maybe won a 3rd, except in his early heroics, officers couldn't win the Medal of Honor. Some of that was done as a teenager after lying about his age to get into the Spanish-American War. He's a little guy who carried a wounded comrade, a soldier, off the field a long way in one of his more heroic enterprises. There's a lot of different aspects to this man. He's not simple. One time he got in trouble for drinking and shenanigans on the base, and then a couple of decades later, when he's the chief of police in Philadelphia, he quits drinking to make sure he sets that example, and he enforces prohibition because it was the law, and he fights, the bootleggers and some of the gangsterism associated with that. He's a lot of things, this Smedley Butler, like most of us. He's dutiful, he's tough. He did all he was asked for. He didn't refuse a mission, even as he got increasingly skeptical of them. If you read his papers, his letters, he's starting to have a lot of skepticism, but he does his duty, mainly for his soldiers, mainly to be the best officer they can have. And then he retires, and he keeps his grunt talk mixed with scholarly value on the road, coast to coast, for 9 years. I mean, he has like a manic mission to his aspect at that time. He has to stop this and lend whatever credibility and voice that he has to do it. There really is no modern equivalent. I fear that the system being as it is currently, there may not be another, and that's a sad thing. His biggest intellectual ethical legacy and contribution, I think, is that he diagnoses what is now called the military-industrial complex or the military-political-industrial complex, you name it. The corruption that makes war profitable for some, while soldiers who served under my command, and a lot of the people here died for $5,000 a year. But they didn't do it for the money. But he points out a lot of this corruption. He says it's a bipartisan issue. This is a Republican military-industrial complex or a Democrat one or any of that. That is a very unifying thing. And how rare today. How rare to have somebody who critiques both elements. In his devil dog language, he's coast to coast talking about he was a racketeer, he was a gangster for some of these big business interests. And this is before a lot of this has developed even more systemically as it has today. One of the reasons you won't see another Smedley Butler, of course, as the system currently is because if a 2 or a 3-star general or even a 1-star general or colonel starts speaking out, making us uncomfortable, making the powerful uncomfortable, he might not get a nice call for a 7-figure job on a lobbying board or you name it. That might not be waiting for him. And I think that his diagnosis of this 25 years before Eisenhower's speech about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address is perhaps one of the most remarkable things about this man, and that he communicated it in a way that soldiers, Marines, people, average people could understand without taking away the value of it. So he did a lot of things. And if you don't believe that this is a bipartisan guy who puts country first, remember that he stops a nascent coup organized somewhat by the right, I suppose. But then he opposes FDR, critiques him, has a massive falling out with the Democrats. And he's unhappy with both sides. And everybody's unhappy with him, and that's usually an idea. I think Scott Horton knows this, that if you make everybody angry, you're probably doing something right. At least that's what we hope. Right, Scott? He stood up for bonus marchers in Washington, World War I veterans who were struggling, facing off against other generals you've heard of who were still active, named MacArthur and Patton, who were shooting the gas into the streets. Given all that, this is a man who nearly predicted the political, economic sort of catastrophe that we are in today. And when I think what would Smedley do, he would raise his voice to the high heavens. He'd be here, and he'd be at every other event, and he'd probably be on Amtrak down to D.C. or wherever the next trip was before he even had time to get lunch. And I'm just glad to be a small part of the urgency that this group is bringing together, the big tent aspect, how they view this issue, that it's not left-right, it's not red-blue, it's the nation, it's the republic. What kind of a country do we want to be? Do we want our children to be raised in a country where they have to see that headline, that a father and a son serve in the same war? The prediction that he made was that when money and congressional influence and a media that's supporting them works together in tandem, you have a formula for a forever war. So as I close out, and I think I'm actually under my time, which is unheard of if you've ever heard me speak or go on a show. And if me and Scott get together on the Scott Horton show, it's over. Like, strap in. But I was Googling a fact about Smedley. I've written a lot about him, but, it's hard to keep it all together. And I wanted to check a fact. And, you go into the Google bar, right? I'm kind of a Luddite, but you go up in the top bar there and you type in Smedley Butler. And dropping down is a name with like a thumbnail with the person's picture and a one-word description of what they are. It kind of like prefigures what you're looking for. And for Smedley Butler, it's a picture of him in his uniform, and it says Smedley Butler, and then it says -critic. Like, that's the one word. And he was a critic, and that's like maybe my favorite part of him. But I thought, what a weird way to encapsulate a life, right? Such a diverse career, right? The Quaker who becomes the career Marine and the Medal of Honors and Chief of Police of Philadelphia and one of the great anti-war dissenters in history, critic. So anyway, I was thinking, I don't know who runs the internet these days, Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. I'm probably dated on that. But, maybe after some fellowship later, I'll send the email that's in my head, and it'll say, Mark and, Bill, I've got a recommendation for the Google bar. So instead of Smedley Butler critic, if we have to pick one word, let's put Smedley Butler, prophet, because that's what he was. And I'm just so proud to be here today. And thank you, Dan, for having me.
Well, he was fantastic, wasn't he? All right, next I'd like to bring up John Emmons, PA's 6th Congressional District candidate, up here. And again, like I said, the first to sign the War's Powers Pledge. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Voice coming through okay? Thank you for being here today. Thanks to Dan for inviting me here today. I am the Republican candidate for the PA 6 congressional seat, which we are right in the center of, right here in lovely Westchester. It really is an honor to be here today, to be part of this ceremony. When Dan first called me, in all honesty, all transparency, I had never heard of Smedley Butler, but I did research. But before I get into that, one thing, Danny mentioned something about politicians. The first thing I want to straighten out is I don't consider myself to be a politician. I consider myself to be a patriot. And the difference between a patriot and a politician is the politician only looks forward to the next election, whereas the patriot looks forward to the next generation. So this is my first time running. I've had a 40-year career. It's time to give back. I consider myself a patriot, not a politician. When I did the research on Smedley, I was impressed. I never realized we had such a hero here in Westchester. But I wanted to share a few of the things that I learned, and just a few, and some of those are a repeat of what Danny mentioned, but these were the things that stuck out to me. One, he was a Westchester resident. We don't have that many notable people coming out of Westchester, at least that I've discovered so far, so that was notable. He had a 33-plus year career in a time that was spanned the early 1900s up through the Depression and slightly beyond that. That was a very unique time, and you can see that when you look at his biography. Also, I think it's a very important to realize that he did receive the Medal of Honor twice, which very, very few people have. I think maybe only 3. So I think that was very interesting. Because I'm running for Congress, the next 2 things kind of stuck out at me as well. His father was a congressman. His father was a congressman for this area and served in a prominent position in naval affairs, and I thought that was very interesting. It also turns out that his maternal grandfather was also a congressman. So I think that family history was there of being engaged in service and what have you. Also, in 1932, Smedley ran for U.S. Senate. I don't know how many people realize that. He ran here in Pennsylvania, obviously, and he did not prevail in the primary. I think he only got about just shy of 40% of the vote, but wouldn't it have been great if he could have become a senator back in 1932? That would have been remarkable. Beyond that, just in summary, I believe, what struck me was the fact, especially in this day of political correctness, he was very outspoken, as you can tell from what Danny had mentioned. He also told it like it is. And if you think back to that day and age, I think you could picture that when you think of Patton and you think of MacArthur and you think of so many other people who spoke from their heart and weren't handcuffed by all the things that we have in political correctness today. So I think, and I'm sure it wasn't easy back then either, but he showed true leadership, and I think that's what we're here today to really underscore. I think the things that also impressed me about him was the fact that he talked about war. He talked about the motivations for war. You heard Danny talk about some of that. He talked about the war profiteering. And I think many of us realize that that is there, especially historically, but not many people want to talk about it and bring attention to it. So the fact that he did that and he continued to do that Even though I'm sure it wasn't comfortable, I think it says a lot about him and what his real resolve was. And in that regard, Danny also mentioned this. Eisenhower, some 20 or 30 years later, reinforced that in his parting speech, where he talked about the military-industrial complex. So I think it is something. It's very important. In my regard, in my role, to me, and especially since I'm an industrialist, I've been in industry for 40 years. Industry has a place. The military-industrial complex, I think there is a need for the military-industrial complex. I say that very guardedly. I think the key point is we always have to be ready in the event of aggression in the world. But what I would say is that absolutely that industrial military complex should not have heavy influence or be able to impact the policies that the government takes. So yes, we need to have that industrial capability, but they should not be able to heavily influence the policies of our United States. Swinging now for a moment to bring our troops home. When Dan called me up, I was very eager to sign the pledge, and I'm happy I did sign the pledge. I would do it again in a nanosecond. I believe it's very important. I think we do need to stop the extended wars. We need to stop those endless wars, because 19 years is far too long. 10 years is far too long. It's very important for us to end the deployments, the multiple deployments. When you talk to people and you see what the impact is of those multiple deployments, obviously it has a great toll on our soldiers. It has a great toll on their families. It has a great toll on our country. And to just continue on, it's a disservice to all involved. So I believe very strongly with Ronald Reagan. I believe strongly in peace through strength. I think that's very important. I believe we have the greatest military on the face of the planet that the planet has ever seen. And I will always support and defend that. But I think part of that support is sending our troops into situations where you have an endless war and endless deployments. I think that's part of our responsibility and commitments to our military, is that we won't do that. And I make that commitment standing here today. I think the key thing is that we don't have these prolonged engagements and policing actions. And I really believe that the military, when you talk to all vets, they will talk in terms of being mission-oriented. That's what our military should be. Have a mission, have a very clear objective, go and perform that objective, and then come home. And that's what we've gotten away from. That's what we're hearing about today. I think it's key that our military defends the United States, but do so in that mission-oriented way and not in the manner of endless ongoing wars. One of the things that I like to state about myself is I believe I'm a constitutionalist. So in keeping with that, I do believe that Congress has the right and responsibility for declaring war. So that's why I wholeheartedly support the pledge. Troops should not be deployed without that. And I think that's very clear. Now, while saying that, I will also say that I believe that the President of the United States, through the War Powers Act, has the right and obligation to deploy troops in a limited capacity to protect the United States. And I think the two are in balance, and I think we are in agreement. Very definitely, we need to have the Congress act and vote to declare war for an extended troop deployment. And I would hold that position very strongly if I go to Washington. And I think the one key point here is to protect the United States. One thing that you often hear is protect the interest of the United States. And I'll draw a line on the word interest, because I would not use the term interest. Yes, I want to support, I want to defend the United States, but when it comes to the word interest, I think that is too open-ended. I think it's too arbitrary. I think it's too vague. And if left to that word, then many of the things that you have seen over the decades are allowed to creep in. So I think that's a very key point about interest. So I gladly joined the call to bring our troops home. And I think we need to bring them home responsibly. So and I won't give you a dissertation on that, but I think it's wrong just to extract our troops and leave a vacuum. I think there needs to be a plan. They're extracted in the right way. They come home, and we don't leave a void where other people can move into that void and create serious problems. But very definitely bring our troops home. Similar to what Danny was talking about, I call on Congress to stop blocking President Trump's attempts to do that. And we've seen that here recently. They need to stop that. And quite honestly, my opponent is part of that blocking maneuver. So in finishing up, I applaud the leadership and the work that the Bring Our Troops Home is doing. It's a very necessary thing. They need to bring that visibility to people. And I applaud all the time and energy that Dan puts into this and the rest of the group. So I will stand in support of that. And I look forward to his comments. So again, thanks for having me. Thanks for the work that's going on. And blessings to Smedley Butler for all the work that he did back 100 years ago and the leadership that he provided that we can learn from today and draw inspiration from today. Thank you very much.
Well, next I'd like to bring up the great Scott Horton.
All right. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. I will not ask you all to memorize this, but I will ask you to try to keep up, okay? I'm going to do some history here. They say that we're fighting the war on terrorism overseas for 19 years now so that we don't have to fight them. But that's just not true. The policy is dominant. American, and it has been for generations. Terrorism is just a side effect of this policy. As the Joint Staff in the Pentagon used to say in the 1990s as a cliche, terrorism is just a small price to pay for being a superpower. Then when terrorism came in a major way on September 11th, they pretended that was the first day in history. And now rather than being a side effect of negative American foreign policies, that now America was on the defensive and had to go and double down our policy of dominance of the Middle East, now in the name of fighting terrorism, when that was never the excuse in the first place. And so now let me explain here that every Middle Eastern intervention in my lifetime, since I was a toddler, has been a disaster and has only led to the next major intervention. So we start in 1979 with Afghanistan. And Jimmy Carter's advisors, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Walter Slocum, recommended that since the American people had the Vietnam syndrome, there was a reluctance to intervene in proxy wars overseas after the last disaster there, that maybe instead of containing communism, we could do the opposite and bait them into overexpansion. We'll give them their own Vietnam, is what they said. A horrible, no-win quagmire that destabilizes the country back home that you wish you'd never done. And maybe we can do this to the Soviet Union. And to that end, on July 3rd, 1979, Jimmy Carter signed a finding authorizing the CIA to begin backing the Afghan Mujahideen, but not only that, to embark on a joint project with the Saudis and the Pakistanis to bring Mujahideen fighters from all across the Middle East and Central Asia and even as far as the Philippines and Indonesia to come to Afghanistan to fight the holy war against the Soviet Union. At first, the plan was to lure the Soviets into invading. Later that year, that's exactly what happened. Also in 1979 was the Iranian Revolution. And this was a reaction to an American coup d'etat, where Ike Eisenhower, military-industrial complex, had sent the CIA to overthrow the democratically elected parliamentary government of Iran in 1953 to reinstall the Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was a brutal right-wing fascist dictator whose secret police, the Savak, tortured dissenters to death and so forth. And so in 1979, there was a true popular revolution that overthrew the regime of the Shah. And so the beginning of the very next year, Jimmy Carter gave the green light to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran to try to overthrow the Iranian government. Saddam, being the minority Sunni leader of a supermajority Shiite country, had real reason to fear that the Iranian revolution, the Shiite-led religious revolution, would bleed into Iraq. So instead, he conscripted all of the Iraqi Shia and sent them to war against Iran to try to prevent it. And so both of these policies, support for the Afghan Mujahideen and support for Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran, lasted throughout the entire Ronald Reagan administration. He picked up both of those policies from Jimmy Carter and kept them, and through the entire Reagan years. Now, the Iran-Iraq war ended up in a stalemate in 1989, and the border had essentially hardly changed at all, and that war was over. But then Saddam Hussein had a problem. Massive war debts to Saudi, Kuwait, and UAE for the price of the war against Iran, and they were calling in all his loans. And without going into too many details, the Americans essentially gave Saddam Hussein a blinking yellow light that it would be okay for him to invade northern Kuwait, to occupy the oil fields and teach the Kuwaitis a lesson for slant drilling under the border, overproducing from shared wells, and refusing to negotiate over war debts when oil was selling at about $10 a barrel at the time. And so he invaded, but then he took the whole country. Now, James Baker, the Secretary of State, and George Bush, originally, they were going to let him get away with it. They weren't going to do anything about it, even after he took the whole country. It wasn't until Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, questioned George Bush's manhood and said, "Don't you go wobbly on me now, Bush," that then the gauntlet was thrown down and America began the build and eventually launched Iraq War I in January of 1991. And based on lies, by the way, lies about murdered infants killed for their stolen incubators, and lies that the Iraqi army was lined up, prepared to invade Saudi Arabia and conquer Riyadh, which was completely fake. But anyway, in the aftermath of Iraq War I, they had a real problem because the Shiites and the Kurds rose up to overthrow Saddam Hussein after George Bush had asked them to do it. But then he changed his mind, and he left them high and dry. And the reason was because they figured out in the cabinet that, wait a minute, we just spent 8 years, 10 years, under Ronald Reagan, the Reagan-Bush administration, backing Saddam Hussein to contain the Iranian Revolution. And if we support the Shiite uprising now, then we're reversing that policy. We're importing the Iranian Revolution into Iran. So Scowcroft and Baker and Bush choked, and they called off support for the uprising, and they let Saddam Hussein massacre more than 100,000 Shiites and Kurds in the great stab in the back in the desert of February and March of 1991. Well, this then became the excuse for the almost permanent, the essentially indefinite Iraq War I that Bill Clinton picked up from H.W. Bush and carried out through the entirety of his 8 years in power. The policy was called dual containment of Iraq and Iran from bases in Saudi Arabia. Now, they could have made peace with Iraq. Saddam was begging to come back in from the cold, and they could have made peace with Iran at the time, too. They had the new reformist president, Rafsanjani, who was doing everything he could to try to suck up to the United States. Instead, they stuck with the policy of Cold War with Iran and warm war with Iraq and the endless no-fly zone bombing and the sanctions, the economic embargo that they kept from 1990 all the way through the Bill Clinton years. And this is what caused Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan's former holy warrior freedom fighter heroes, the Mujahideen, the Arab Afghan Mujahideen who'd fought in the Afghan war, to turn against the United States. And the reason that bin Laden was able to take over the Iran group and then merge it with Egyptian Islamic Jihad was based on the new consensus among all these disparate mujahideen from all around the Middle East that we've got to focus on America, the far enemy. We can never succeed in our local revolutions as long as America is the dominant force in the Middle East and will always come and bail out Pharaoh Mubarak in Egypt or King Abdullah or King Fahd and later Abdullah in Saudi Arabia. And so the point was to attack the United States, scare us away, but to bait, to give us our own Vietnam again in Afghanistan. And bin Laden himself explained this publicly over and over again in his CNN interviews, his interviews with The Independent, and all the other newspapers in the 1990s. He explicitly said, we are trying to replicate the exact policy that you helped us do to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And now we're going to do it to you. And so they attacked us all through the 1990s, beginning with the World Trade Center attack in 93. Then there were a couple of attacks in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, the National Guard. There was the terrible Khobar Towers attack where 19 airmen were killed that the Bill Clinton government blamed on Iran, even though it was Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that had done it. And then, of course, the African embassies in 98 and the USS Cole in the year 2000, and finally culminating in the September 11th attack. Then when September 11th came, the TV images were almost a perfect deception. It was just like in the cliche. The attack came out of the clear blue sky. And the American people were left to wonder, well, what is going on here? And the answer was, they hate you because you're innocent. They hate you because you're good. They hate you because you have values. You love your daughter and Jesus, and they want to cut your son's head off and convert the rest of you all to Sharia, and all just lies. When the reality was, they were doing that to provoke an overreaction, to provoke the United States into making the fatal error of invading Afghanistan. And in bin Laden's point of view, kill them all, let God sort them out. The Soviets had killed 1 million Afghans. This is the war that bin Laden wanted to replicate. And he didn't care how many Afghans died, as long as the American empire would be broken and would finally go home from the region at the end of the war, the way the Soviet Union had done. Now, if all that's true, and it is, then what does that mean about the war in Iraq, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen? As the former chief of the CIA's bin Laden unit, Michael Scheuer, said about Iraq War II, this was Bush's hoped for but unexpected gift to bin Laden. This is more than he ever could have hoped for. You're going to get rid of the socialist infidel Saddam Hussein for me too? Fine. And as we all know from the history of Iraq War II, Danny can tell you, he was there, that we went from approximately 400 members of Al-Qaeda on September 11th to thousands, tens of thousands by the end of Iraq War II. And luckily, this is a small parenthesis, but luckily, the local Sunni population of Iraq turned on the Al-Qaeda guys, the foreign fighters, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the war suicide bombers and head choppers, and marginalized them. It wasn't Bush and Petraeus that defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was the local Iraqi Sunni tribal leaders in Baathis who were sick of their chaos and got rid of them for us, which was absolutely a miracle. I mean, Bush gives them the entire western half of Iraq, and then the western half of Iraq takes it back away from them again. Well, that was great. Until... Pardon? Until Barack Obama took their side in Libya and Syria. Now, this sounds completely crazy. To this day, people won't believe it because it is high treason. It's absolutely unbelievable that when the Libyan veterans of Iraq War II, who had fought with Zarqawi, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and Ansar al-Sharia, who were essentially the Libyan members of al-Qaeda in Iraq, when they came home to Libya, Obama took their side and helped them to overthrow the Gaddafi government. And of course, Libya's been in a terrible state of civil war for now 9 years, ever since that time. And including ISIS created a big beachhead there in the town of Sirte for a couple of years, and a year or so in about 2015 and 16, and created total chaos. And then absolutely unbelievably, he did the same thing in Syria. And the answer is obvious and it's clear, and he explained why. We're doing this because we empowered Iran in Iraq War II. Bush Jr. went ahead and picked up where his father left off and imported the Iranian Revolution and gave them sway over the Shia who controlled the new government in Baghdad. And man, they wish they hadn't done that. They hate the Ayatollah, and they hate the Shiite, what they call the Shiite crescent of power, based in Tehran. America's allies are the Sunni states of Arabia, of course, Israel, Jordan, Turkey. The Sunni axis. So what Bush had done in Iraq War II was a massive own goal, even from the point of view of what the empire wanted to see. And so to correct for that, they decided they had to launch what they called the redirection. You can read the great Seymour Hersh article. You really should read the great Seymour Hersh article, The Redirection from 2007. And it goes like this. They went and said they were sorry to the Saudi king. Now how can we make it up to you? And the answer was, get rid of Assad in Damascus. Because Assad, as an Alawite, even though Syria is a secular dictatorship, he was an Alawite and allied closely with Iran. And if George W. Bush gave Iran Baghdad, we can't reverse that. But maybe we can take Damascus away from them. And so for 5 years, Barack Obama's government, in alliance with Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, funneled billions of dollars to al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. The bad guys from Iraq War II were now the moderate rebels trying to save Syria from its government that, of course, was backed by the vast majority of the population of the country, and especially all of the wide and disparate religious and ethnic minorities there. And then you all know where this goes. ISIS broke away from al-Qaeda, and in 2013 they consolidated total control over eastern Syria, and 1 year later they rolled in and took over all of western, predominantly Sunni Iraq, and created a new state, the Islamic State, the holy ordained caliphate, that was the size of Great Britain. And that lasted 3 years. Of course, Barack Obama then had to launch Iraq War III to correct the mistake, the result of his intervention in Syria. And that war, of course, continues with American forces, still approximately 6,000 or 7,000 special operations forces in Iraq and in Syria right now. And in both cases, in the name of ISIS, when they're really there because of the Shia in Iraq and the Alawites in Damascus. Okay? Now, the same story in a much shorter format in Somalia. Bush intervened in Somalia in 2001, started backing the warlords. You guys remember Black Hawk Down, where the Rangers in Delta were killed in 93? Well, they were hunting a warlord named Adid. Well, Bush started backing Adid's son, as long as he would promise to hunt down and kill Islamists. Well, of course, he did whatever he wanted. And the more he did whatever he wanted, the more opposition he got, the more the CIA backed him, the worse war crimes he committed. And it wasn't until 2005, 4 years after Bush intervened in Somalia, that they created what was called the Islamic Courts Union. War is the health of the state. In this case, war created the state just to kick the warlords out, the American-backed warlords out. And 1 year later, America backed the Ethiopian invasion, Christmas 2006. And it was only then that al-Shabaab, the current boogeyman, declared loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri and al-Qaeda. It was only then that they picked up their rifles and began to fight. They had been the smallest, least important part of the new Somali government that had been created in reaction to our intervention. Now they're the worst part, and we've been fighting them since 2006 with no end in sight. And I'll skip Mali and Yemen and Niger and Chad and Burkina Faso and Nigeria and the rest of the places across especially Africa, where Special Operations Forces are chasing the war on terrorism now. Because I got to get to the point. Bin Laden's plan worked, mostly. Lure the United States into overextension and self-destruction. Discredit and destabilize America's client regimes in the region. Radicalize the population of the region in terms of religion and politics. The only thing left is to overthrow the Ayatollah's regime in Iran, which our current president threatens regularly to do, and has a maximum pressure campaign that is based on achieving that goal. Or I suppose they could actually put Ayman al-Zawahiri himself on the Pharaoh's throne in Cairo. Other than that, they've basically accomplished everything that bin Laden was trying to accomplish. And America has been serving their enemy's interest this entire terror war long. It's time to stop doing Osama bin Laden's bidding and call off this phony war on terrorism. And that brings me to the importance of bringourtroopshome.us. I'm not a veteran. I hope nobody got the impression I was claiming I was one for being here today. I'm the guy from antiwar.com. I've been right about this all along and saw it all along. And you probably won't be too surprised to know that I've had in my audience over the years a great many combat veterans from the terror wars who've come home and found out the truth and become my followers and in many cases my friends. And for years I have asked them to do this. For years this was my dream come true. If Ross Perot died and left me his billions, what would I do with it? I'd have hit the road looking for Dan McKnight. And of all of my combat veteran friends that I've asked to take this on, it's just been too big of a project. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the wherewithal. They didn't know how to do it. But when I found out that Dan McKnight had created this group, I've done everything I can to help support it and spread the word about it this whole time ever since then. And, well, let me explain why. I mentioned I'm with antiwar.com. When my friend Shauna first showed me antiwar.com, I said, what's that, some socialist thing? She said, no, look. They run Ron Paul. And I went, oh, wow. And it turns out, guess what? Libertarian, laissez-faire capitalists have owned the URL antiwar.com since 1995. It's not socialists at all. It's right-leaning libertarians, especially our late great editorial director, Justin Raimondo, was kind of a big gay Archie Bunker, right-wing Buchananite, an extremely anti-war guy. And that was how I knew they were cool. They published Ron Paul. It was easy, especially at that time, the beginning of the terror war, for liberals and leftists to oppose George W. Bush, him and all his oil man friends from Houston and all those things. It fit right into their paradigm. But to have real American patriots, conservative and right-wing leaning Republicans and libertarians hold fast and continue to oppose the wars in spite of all the pressure and all the propaganda after September 11th, that was extremely meaningful to me. And, of course, Raimondo and Ron Paul as two of the very greatest when it comes to that. And so let's talk about Ron Paul a little bit. What did Ron Paul do in the campaigns of 2008 and 2012? He changed millions of minds to be anti-war. Millions of people. And how'd he do it? He did it because he looked just like George W. Bush, an old, white, Methodist, Republican politician from Texas. As far as image goes, he was straight out of the cloning machine, and yet he comes out and said the most anti-war things, at least implicit in all of his statements were, forget Michael Moore and Jane Fonda and the Answer Coalition. I'm way more anti-war than them, and for a lot better reasons, too. In 2008, he was the only vet in the race. And he was against these reasons, against the wars, because he wanted to save the Republic. He wanted to save the Constitution. He wanted to save the U.S. dollar. And his arguments were the ones that allowed people to break from their previous bad policy. If you like your identity, you can keep it. I'm not asking you to move left. I'm asking you to get smart and see through the fake reasons, at the very least, to be generous, the not good enough reasons to keep us in these wars. And I never named it this. Okay? This is Michael Bolden named it, the Scott Horton rule. You attack the right from the right and the left from the left. No left-wingers impressed by right-wing argument or vice versa. You got to meet people where they're at. And that's something that BringOurTroopsHome.us is doing so well right now. Anything that makes people's knee jerk and think of Janis Joplin and tie-dye and Jane Fonda and Ron Kovic, born on the 4th of July, with moving far left and growing your hair out in your old dirty flak jacket, Vietnam, peace sign, era peace signs and this kind of thing. People react so hard against that. But when you bring them an argument by the likes of Dan McKnight and by the likes of BringOurTroopsHome.us, which is entirely led by combat veterans from this century, from these terror wars that are still going on. And when they tell you they've not moved left, they've not found peace and utopianism, they just got smarter, they just saw through it, then that is opening a doorway for many others to come through. Now, the most important invention of our current time here in terms of anti-war sentiment on the right has been the campaign and then the presidency of Donald Trump. He had to run against Bush and Obama's wars to win that nomination and win the presidency 4 years ago. And he has, escalated the wars, and there's a lot to criticize, but he has made a real deal with the Taliban to withdraw from Afghanistan by next May, and he at least sincerely wants to end the rest of the terror wars and bring our troops home. And so now, BringOurTroopsHome.us has an incredibly important mission. You guys have an incredibly important mission. That is, you have to solidify the gains that Trump has made on the right. When the local TV news reporter sticks his microphone in the face of a guy at a pro-Trump rally and says, "Why do you support Trump?" I saw this last week, an old guy who guarantee supported all of Bush's wars, 100%. Says, "I like Donald Trump because he's bringing us home from all our endless no-win wars." So he's following his leader. This is what the president says. He's our guy. And that kicked that door open, right, for right-wing, rank-and-file Republican voters of America to get over it. And so now this is where BringOurTroopsHome.us comes in, is because we have to solidify these gains. Trump might lose in 2 weeks. I personally don't think he's going to, but he might. And we could have a President Tom Cotton or a President Dan Crenshaw in as little as 4 years from now or 8 years from now. And when Dan Crenshaw is the president and says we have to go back to Afghanistan because the Taliban is so ruthless, or we have to go to Iran because, the Ayatollah looked at the Israelis funny, or whatever it is, what is the American right going to do? How are they going to react? Are they going to follow Crenshaw the way they follow Bush? Are they going to follow Dan McKnight and the conservative-leaning and libertarian-leaning combat veterans of the war on terror era who have been there and know better and refuse and demand that the rest refuse and say absolutely not, will we go for this again? And that is a huge responsibility that you guys carry, but you absolutely have to succeed. And, I have to say one thing real quick. Oh, I'm bad on time here. A couple of things. I wanted to give this important example. In the year 2013, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Al-Qaeda false flag sarin attack in Ghouta in the suburbs of Damascus in August of 2013. And there was a major push to get Barack Obama to follow through with regime change there, to bomb Damascus, possibly even send in troops, certainly launch a major air campaign. And you know who stopped that war? I'd like to say it was antiwar.com. It wasn't. It was Stephen Bannon and Breitbart that stopped that war, because they knew enough to know that we're on the bad guy's side in Syria. And what they did was they ran article after article, which became the source for every AM talk radio show host in this country, that said, why would we go to war for Al-Qaeda against a secular dictator in a three-piece suit? This makes no sense. And there were viral videos and JPEGs going around on the internet of Marines and Army veterans holding up cardboard signs covering most of their face that said, I didn't fight in Iraq for 5 years so that I could take Al-Qaeda's side in Syria. And they kept doing that over and over again. And so the establishment, they can't rely on liberals except to look the other way when Obama's launching a war. But liberals in America, progressives and leftists, they're not hawks. They're just not. Ever since Vietnam, they're just not. If there's a population in America that can be relied on to support war, it's the Republican Party voters of America, the Tea Party of America. How do they feel about it? And in this case, how they felt about it was absolutely hell no. And that was it. There was no base out here in flyover country to support the policy. And so the policy died. And Obama instead made a deal with Putin to get rid of Syria's chemical weapons and avoid the war, which was absolutely the best outcome. And is another reason that you know the two major sarin attacks that happened after that were also fake false flags, because they had given up all their chemicals back in 2013. But anyway, so that shows the importance of what I'm talking about here, about attacking the right from the right, and about making sure to undermine any support among the broad swath of the American right for any further American intervention. In conclusion, finally, folks, we must be right that it is long time past to end the war on terrorism. The calendar proves it. It's as simple as that. So now let's win this fight and bring our troops home. Thank you.
All right, and now we're going to bring up Dan McKnight himself.
I'm not nearly as eloquent or long-winded as Danny and Scott, so I'll keep this short. But I want to thank everybody for coming out here today. In the face of the COVID pandemic, the numbers are down than what we would like to see, but we have people watching all over the country on many of our live streams, and I want to just say hello to them. I want to thank the Westchester Police Department for being here, supporting the traffic control, and for all of you for being here, and Scott and Danny for their remarks. Never before has our nation had the opportunity to silently offer a collective prayer for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who are off fighting in a war that started before they were born. War powers and the ability to wage war was a great concern to the founding fathers of our country and the framers of our Constitution. Committing the lives of United States citizens and our military to a war such a solemn power that they did not want the control in one hand or a small set of hands. They gave the power to declare war to Congress, to the people's house of the government, so that if war was necessary for defense or to defend American interests, that the people that voted for war, congressmen like what John Emmons is running for, would have to go back to their hometown and look their constituents in the face and explain why they sent our sons and daughters off to war. President Abraham Lincoln famously offered, and I quote, "The provision of the Constitution giving the war-making powers to Congress was dictated by the following reasons. Kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally that the good of the people was the objective. This was understood to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions, and our founders resolved to frame the Constitution so that no one man should have the power to bring that oppression upon us. Congress has abdicated their constitutional duties and responsibilities regarding war. It's been 70 years since Congress declared war, which is required by the Constitution. The last time they declared war, does anybody here know when that was? 42, and against Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania in World War II. Since that time, Republicans and Democrats alike in Congress have collectively, willfully, and freely given away their authority to the executive branch, to a single person. Their most solemn duty to declare war and protect the interests of the United States, to protect the citizens of the United States, has been freely given away without repercussion. This abdication of power in Congress has destroyed the delicate checks and balances that were put in place by our framers. The United States is now engaged in a 19-year perpetual and endless war. We've been there for 19 years. I want you to think about that for just a second. We have members in our communities, children that go to school with our children, kids that grew up in our neighborhood. We watched out in the yard playing ball. Danny's from New Jersey. It wasn't baseball in New Jersey. It was stickball, right? Right. People that we watched, our friends, are now fighting in a war that started before they were even born. There's no doubt we were attacked by Islamic extremists on 9/11, and our response was proper, and it was probably just. And America wanted revenge. But the mission in Afghanistan was clearly defined in a utterly meaningless authorization of use of military force. On September 18th in 2001, the authorization of use of military force gave the President of the United States a blank check to go anywhere, to spend any amount of money, and for any length of time to commit our military to fight anybody that he deemed had attacked us on September 11th. And on this day in 2001, October 19th, 2001, 200 Army Rangers from the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment parachuted out of 4 C-130 aircrafts into southern Afghanistan, into the airfield in Kandahar, and began the longest war in our nation's history. The authorization of use of military force did not call for anything that we're doing in Afghanistan today. It was very specific. It gave the president the authorization to use all necessary and appropriate force for those nations, organizations, or persons that he determined, planned, authorized, or committed or aided the terrorist attacks on September 11th, or anybody that harbored those people. That's it. The AUMF authorized force against anybody, again, I'm going to say it again, who planned the attacks, who committed the attacks, or who aided the attacks, or who harbored those people. Well, by February of 2002, we'd accomplished that mission, 5 months after the initial invasion. Every single person who attacked us on 9/11 was dead. Every person who had planned or aided in the attack had been killed or captured or was in Guantanamo Bay, except for Osama bin Laden, and the terror training camps in Afghanistan had been destroyed for generations. The only missing piece was the killing and capture of Osama bin Laden, and that was taken care of by our Navy SEALs in 2011. The mission was accomplished. It was time to come home, but we took the eye off the prize. President Bush turned his attention to the next shiny object in Iraq, like we heard Scott talk about. The reason that happened is because we had no oversight. Congress had given away their authority. They'd given away their ability to conduct oversight in the mission. And the reason they gave it away is because we never went to Congress in the first place to get a declaration of war. The military fought with honor and distinction, and I'm honored to call myself a veteran. We fought with professionalism and the most restraint that you can fathom. The restraint that the American military has in combat is undescribable. The constraints that are put on them by our politicians who are so fast to jump in front of a camera that it makes our job as veterans dangerous. But our military is now nation building. We're peacekeeping. We're building roads, schools, bridges, water treatment facilities, and any number of other really worthy objects, but they're not the purpose of the military. That's not the purpose of the AUMF, and it wasn't part of the authorization that sent us there. I'm from Idaho, about 3,000 miles from here, and my senator is Senator Jim Risch, and he serves as the chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, probably the second most powerful man in foreign policy in the country, next only to President Trump. And I questioned him in an event in Idaho in 2019, in February, and he did a complete about-face on American foreign policy. 70 years of foreign policy. He did an about-face and said, Dan, I'm with you. I'm through with nation building. President Trump has campaigned and likely won the election on a promise to end the endless wars. He signed the Doha deal and promised to have the last of our troops home by Christmas. We've seen a shift in conservative Republicans who are now aligning with many of the pacifist left who oppose the neocons and the liberal war hawks who keep us in perpetual and endless war. America is repudiating the hawks like John Bolton and Liz Cheney, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry. 85% of the members of Congress who signed the authorization of use of military force are no longer in Congress. Think about that for a second. 85% of the 530-something members of Congress that signed the authorization are gone. They no longer have to answer to the people for the decision to go to war. We now have a Congress that is comprised of 85% of its members who continually ignore the state of perpetual war because of one singular reason. It wasn't their war to begin with. They didn't authorize the war because they weren't even in office yet. They didn't abdicate their role and their responsibility. They didn't fail to provide oversight. They didn't fail to call on senior government officials, diplomats, and generals to come before their committees and answer the 20-year unanswered question, what is our mission and what is our strategy? As I look at the veterans that are here today, those of us that fought in the global war on terror, collectively, we are saying to Congress now, this is my war. I will not pass this war on to another generation, to my children, to my grandchildren. We cannot pass it on to them. We cannot shirk our moral responsibility to hold our elected representatives responsible for allowing fellow citizens to deploy to a forgotten war over and over and over and over and over. Our active duty military cannot maintain the pace of the missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, or any of the other 49 nations in which we're fighting across the African continent. When we wisely stopped the draft in 1973, we had 11% of our adult population in the country that served in the military. Today, that number is 0.5%, meaning that 99.5% of our population has literally no skin in the game when it comes to the perpetual and endless war. Our active duty military cannot maintain the pace of the mission on multiple war fronts without consistently, repeatedly, and systematically deploying people over and over again, and then reaching down into the states and taking federal control of the state's militias, the National Guard. In Pennsylvania, I believe the number is 47. 47 National Guardsmen that have died in the global war on terror. Think about that for a moment. These are people that live next to you, that work in your hometowns, that are mechanics and builders and tradesmen, lawyers, doctors, that also serve on the weekend to protect the state of Pennsylvania. 47 have died in the global war on terror. This is the crux of the problem. War has not been declared, and we fundamentally do not know what we're doing there. And we know that now because of what was released last December in the shocking bombshell report, the Afghanistan Papers. And if you haven't read them yet, I highly encourage you to look up Afghanistan Papers and just take 5 minutes and read just the bullet points and see that we truly don't know what we're doing there. The military cannot and should not be the easy button for an out-of-control U.S. foreign policy. The military cannot and should not be used to prop up the opium trade in Afghanistan or the morally bankrupt pedophile culture known as bachi-bazi. The military cannot and should not be deployed to build roads, schools, or nation build. That simply is not the mission of the United States military. Socrates, Danny, you'll appreciate this as a history professor. Socrates, at the height of the Greek Empire, he was brought before a jury and put on trial for not recognizing the gods that were recognized by the state. In his own defense, Socrates likened himself to the gadfly, stinging the lazy giant steed, which was the Athenian state. Without him, Socrates claimed that the state was drifting into a deep sleep, but through his influence, as irritating as it may be to some, he was able to sting repeatedly and waken the state to a productive state. Well, I don't recognize the gods that our nation state has repeatedly worshipped. The gods of perpetual war, the gods of war profiteering, the gods of the military industrial complex. I'm here, and you all should be too, to be the gadfly that stings the giant steed of the United States Congress, to waken them from a deep sleep, to be productive and virtuous in manners of war and foreign policy. I want to encourage each of you to take a stand and say enough is enough. We need to become the gadfly and repeatedly sting our congressmen and our senators. And John, if you win and go to Washington, I will be stinging you consistently. And I know that you'll be an ally, and I look forward to working with you. We must return to an America First foreign policy founded in the principles of the Constitution. We must strive for peace. President Trump said in his State of the Union address that after nearly 2 decades of war, the hour has come to at least try for peace. My God, can we at least try for peace? I think the next generation of sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines deserve our best efforts to hold Congress accountable. I'm honored to be here today. I'm humbled by the attendance. I'm humbled by those that are watching. I'm grateful to see friends that have been to multiple events with us, that have stood by my side, that have supported us and buttressed us up and encouraged us to keep fighting, because we will fight. We will continue pushing until we rid ourselves of the neocon and the liberal war hawks in Washington, D.C., that are encouraged to do nothing more than keep us in a perpetual state of endless war. At this time, I'm honored to have the opportunity to pay my respect to a legend. The Marine Corps is full of icons, and we learn about them when we go through basic training. I have some Marines that are over here, and there's some out here in the crowd. When you go through basic training, every night before you go to bed, we would say, "Good night, Chesty Puller, wherever you are." Chesty Puller was a great Marine. And we learn about his legacy. We learn about people like Colonel John Glenn and Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, the sniper. But Major General Smedley Butler is among the Mount Rushmore of Marine icons that deserves our respect and deserves to be honored for his service in the uniform, and especially for what he did after he retired. At this time, I'll be joined by a Marine. The Marine Corps has a tradition of honor of the oldest Marine and the youngest Marine taking part in a ceremony. And Fred LeClaire, who is here with the Marine Corps Legion of Westchester County, and myself, I believe. Are there any Marines in the audience that are younger than 45? Yes. All right. I'm going to have you come up here, please, if you would. And Fred, are you here? You want to come up and join us too? Come on. What's your name? Mark and Fred. I'm going to ask them to take this wreath and then place it on the grave of General Smedley Butler. And the color guard, if they're going to advance here in just a second, when they do, I would ask that we please come to attention, place your hand over your heart, and as the Marines lay the wreath, we're going to call them to attention, and they're going to salute. And we have a bugler from the Marine Corps League of Westchester County that's going to play taps. And I ask for just a moment of silence while that's being played, and I'm going to ask you to please reflect on your children. If you have a child that is a teenager right now, 17, 18 years old, I want you to think about them right now going off to fight in a war that started before they were even conceived. And with that, we'll advance to the blaying of the wreath. Devil dogs.
Please dance. Arm.
once again, I want to thank the Marine Corps League of Westchester County. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. This concludes our events for the evening. I pray that you will take a moment to think about the message that's been shared today. Contact your congressman. On the back of the program, in the insert, there's a couple quotes from Butler and President Trump here, and also a call to action. What you can do. Please call your representative in Congress and insist that they support an American first foreign policy that does not automatically default to the use of the military. The military should be used as a last resort, and I know that my military brethren here will say that if you ask us to go, we'll go. We'll answer the bell. But we ask that Congress please put your name on the line before we put our boots on the ground. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your attendance.